Afternoon. Okay, so hello everybody, good afternoon and welcome to our Housing Solutions Platform debate on collective housing transformation. My name is Ruth Owen and I'm the Deputy Director at Fianza. Housing Solutions Platform is an initiative that we've launched in cooperation with Fondation Abbé Pierre and Housing Europe, the aim of which is to identify and promote innovative, practical solutions to provide affordable, accessible housing to people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. And the objective of today's debate is to look at how non-residential buildings like hotels, shops, student housing is a residential building, but non-typical housing, collective buildings like offices, homeless shelters, hotels, motels, can be converted into permanent supported housing for people who need it. And it's an opportune moment to be looking at this question because the COVID-19 pandemic and the related economic impact has had quite big implications for building use in cities, and it raises many challenges, but also perhaps some opportunities in terms of housing solutions. So the aim of the debate is really to dig into that and to look at how we can use these settings to provide permanent affordable housing for people who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. The debate's going to kick off with a presentation by my colleague, Chloé Serre-Morin, who has written a short report on this issue called Upcycling Buildings, and it's collected some of the examples that we're aware of in Europe and further afield to try and describe this model and dig into the success factors if we want to make this work as a way of bringing more housing for people who need it online quickly and at scale. So Chloe is going to present the report, and then we have a very dense program of really exciting speakers for a program of 2 hours. So I'll try very hard to keep us to time. And we should have some time for Q&A. The event is being recorded, and also there's interpretation from English to French and vice versa. If you want to use the interpretation, you click on the little globe icon on the toolbar, which says interpretation, and then select the language channel. The interpreters have also given a little summary in the chat about how to do that. And we'll have a couple of opportunities for question and answers during today's session. There's a chat function, and you can put questions at any time into the chat, and we'll collect them and put them to the panelists during the Q&A session. So before handing over to Chloe, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone. Huge thanks to the speakers for all saying yes.
Mais écoute, il faut voir, parce que toi, le LEMA, ils sont en train de faire une enquête. Ce serait bien le LEMA, mais en fait, le gouvernement wallon, il a fait une enquête.
Il y a quelqu'un qui parle en français. Je me demande, s'il vous plaît, de...
It's Gregor. He's not in the image right now, so you can mute him.
Okay, if you're not speaking, could you please make sure that you're muted, because that really helps with the large number of people participating online. And so I was just saying thanks very much to the speakers, really looking forward to the discussion, and thanks also to Council of Europe Development Bank, who is a partner with us in this debate. And I'd like to hand over to Chloe now to present the report.
Thank you, Ruth. Hi, everyone. I'm Chloé Serme-Morin. I'm very happy to be here today and to present you the main highlights of our recent report. I'm just going to share my screen up. And that should work. So we started working on this topic on upcycling buildings at the beginning of the year with my colleagues from FIANSA, Fondation Abbé Pierre, and the Council of Europe Development Bank. Maybe we should start by some elements of context and why we think we should look into the conversion of non-residential buildings and to make it housing solutions for those in need. I think there are four main context elements that we should mention here. The first one being the fact that for the past 10 years, at least, we have been witnessing rises in housing exclusion and homelessness in Europe in increasingly closed and dense housing markets. Then we have the fact that we had the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic on people in housing difficulties that had been resulting in protective emergency policies, and that has changed our way of thinking about how to protect homeless people and people in housing difficulties. Also the fact that the pandemic had consequences on how we use or don't use some buildings, such as empty hotels and office buildings, etc., with the fact that tourism was decreasing and like remote work being more and more used. We have those new possibilities of using buildings for different purposes. And also the fact that for a lot of years now, we saw on the ground lots of experiences and implementation with a diversity of practices for this conversion from hotels to homes, lots of experiences in the US, for instance, and we are very happy to have some representatives today that will be able to speak a bit better about their experience there today. We also have what has been implemented in Finland for the past 10 years as the conversion of congregate emergency accommodation into long-term housing. So very diverse examples, and we tried with this paper to understand and to see what are the common challenges and criteria needed to do such projects. Maybe also to say, and that's something that is always quite striking to me, that we live today in a society where the reality and the norm is to basically put tourists in houses, and this is what Airbnb does, and to put homeless people who need homes into hotel rooms. And maybe today it's also quite interesting to rethink a bit this reality and to question it as it has to be done. So maybe just to dig quickly on this context. Those are the estimates that FIANSA has made 2 years ago on the number of homeless people in Europe, so pre-pandemic. And we estimate that at least 700,000 people are sleeping rough or in emergency or temporary accommodation on any one night in the European Union. And it has been a 70% increase compared to 10 years before. And as you can see on this map here, we don't have, of course, we don't have any homeless data comparable with the common methodology in Europe, but we have several trends that can be highlighted. And in all European countries, except in Finland, in the past years, several forms of homelessness have been increasing in European countries. Then we have this context of the pandemic and COVID-19, the fact that an inherent risk was related to housing deprivation and homelessness with higher infection risks due to collective accommodation and promiscuity and overcrowding. And also economic consequences, because the pandemic hit hardest people in risk or in poverty or exclusion. And we saw rises in extreme poverty with a diversification of profiles, and this has effects on the rising levels of homelessness. And what was clearly interesting to see during the past year is the fact that these challenges resulted in protective emergency measures from several member states in Europe. So different local authorities gathered expertise and gathered political will to mobilize hotels, vacant private buildings, modular housing, and turning it into homeless accommodation. We saw a surge in provision of accommodation during the pandemic. And we also saw quite exceptional moratoriums on evictions. So very positive and quick solutions for people who are in need. And the results have been limiting the spread of COVID-19 for the most vulnerable, but also better living conditions for people benefiting from those measures. As we always analyze in our reports every year, we see that many of those measures, unfortunately, are temporary, and we still face a lack of long-term vision and inadequacy of funding and policy. And that's also where those debates like this one today is very important, to try to shift the vision and to discuss about dignified lasting housing solutions for everybody. Maybe just also to come back to the benefits of those projects of converting congregate accommodation or non-residential buildings into housing units. We have a social and human benefits, of course, the fact that you provide people with a better residential stability, with feeling at home and improvements in health, well-being and social inclusion. This is basically what was out of, for instance, the policy of Finland with the conversion of congregate accommodation into housing first units. And we also have the argument of the cost of emergency accommodation being very costly. So basically investing in long-term housing solutions offer a better economic alternative for public authorities. It's always important to also speak about money today when we speak about those topics. So before going into the criteria and the challenges that are faced by this project, just to say that those conversion projects represent major investment and radical intervention in terms of build structure, in terms of legal provisions and planning, adequation to final users' needs, etc. And the projects that we have been in contact with are very diverse. And I think it will be very interesting to have the discussion after this presentation to understand all the subtleties and the differences between countries and local contexts, etc., etc. Yeah. To go into the paper itself and how we can upcycle those non-residential buildings, the first step would be to set objective and assess the feasibility of the project. So basically combining the interests of future residents and the interests of the different stakeholders involved. So first you have the financial and technical and administrative criteria. So how you evaluate the renovation potential of the building and how you analyze it alongside the different risks. And you also have this very important quality criteria for the end users, and how you address future residents' needs, and how you evaluate costs referred to that. So in the publication, we tried to understand different criteria to have a successful conversion and also identify some challenges. Of course, it's not comprehensive, and I think it will be very interesting to have some feedback afterwards from the speakers today, maybe complete those criteria and those challenges, because of course, we chose those three each, but lots of things remain to discuss. But for the ones that we chose here, so basically the three criteria for successful conversion would be first to demonstrate that the project is being developed in a favorable environment with positive and dynamic partnerships. So basically having a coherent housing policy that is supportive of the dynamic is quite important, because those projects are huge to implement, and responsibilities have to be clear, and that's definitely quite important. Then you have the financial feasibility and the assessment of the investment opportunities, planning the financial model, etc. I'm not going into depth here because I think we will have a panel that will be able to dig into that a bit later. But I would like to focus more on the last one, on the fact that it's very important to focus on the needs of the beneficiaries, and taking into account the profile of future residents is key. And here, for instance, very concretely, you will not think a project in the same way if you want to rehouse a homeless family with financial difficulties, or if you want to rehouse victims of domestic violence, or if you want to rehouse people with high support needs and addiction issues, for instance. And you have, like, the project has to be clear from the beginning if it aims to provide just housing or housing with additional supports. If support is included, it comes at a price, and this must be assessed and planned from the preparation phase of the project. Yeah, people's needs has to be taken into account regarding, for instance, also access to transport, access to the city and employment opportunities, etc. So questions to ask here, and I think this will be important for the debates and the discussions after the presentation now. Maybe asking the project from the beginning, are the available housing units actually permanent? Are the leased through individual contracts that give tenants rights and responsibilities without being conditional upon sobriety or receiving treatment, etc.? And here we face, of course, some challenges depending on profiles of people. For instance, we have been in contact with lots of stakeholders saying that the main challenge for these kind of solutions would be to offer these solutions to people, asylum seekers or people without residence permit or with a complicated administrative status. And here, I think we will be able to discuss a bit more afterwards, but all those questions around support and the profile of people and beneficiaries are definitely very important to take into account. Then I would like to pass to the three challenges, three main challenges that are faced by conversion projects. And there are lots of other ones, but these are the three that would be our focus here. First of all, the overcoming of legal and technical barriers. One of the main barrier that is faced by projects, conversion projects on the ground is, for instance, changing the building's designated use from commercial to residential. And for instance, the non-renewal of the trading license of a hotel. which nonetheless is paid for as part of the purchase price, it can represent a loss of an asset, and it can be particularly costly for publicly funded operations, basically. So for instance, in the paper, you will find an example from France where the DRIL, which is the Regional and Interdepartmental Directorate of Housing and Accommodation in Ile-de-France, so Paris region, launched a trial measure to take over hotels and to create boarding houses, pensions de famille, which are homeless accommodation and homeless, like housing collective and private housing for homeless people. And they are looking for ways to adapt to the local legislation and to fit into the possibilities offered. They adapt and readjust their targets along the way. So this is a very interesting example of trying to get along with the local legal barriers. And maybe also just describing the second challenge here, the risks of deregulations and the implications it represents for quality. And here, maybe one example of something that didn't work at all. And this is the permitted development policy in the UK. And we see like here that loosening regulations carry a significant risk for the quality and location of housing. And this is, of course, essential for the well-being and social inclusion of future residents. And here the example of Harlow in England, and it's the result of the regulation that the housing market has undergone in recent years, which enables housing to be built out of former offices and retail units without planning permissions or without any building permits. Apparently, it is believed that more than 65,000 apartments have been built this way in the UK. And here, this example of Harlow, we have resulted in cramped and poorly insulated housing units that are unsuitable for families. And the people who were housed there found themselves wrenched from their social networks and struggling to find any work possibilities because they were basically very far away from the city. And as you can see here, described as like an open prison, etc. So definitely not what we could say and describe as a housing solution. So yeah, maybe that was the main things that I wanted to highlight here. Just also to conclude on what we would recommend. And these are broad, and I think it would be very interesting to know if people think that we are missing some important messages here. So the first one would be making the convention program part of an overall objective to create adequate housing. So user's choice, affordable rent, security of tenure. Also ensure the quality of the housing created. Also design a program in terms of long-term objectives, but also in cooperation with a wide network of stakeholders. Of course, the needs and expectations of new users must be the starting point of any conversion strategy. And finally, having a budget that is assessed in a realistic and holistic manner. I hope I was not too long, but I think I'm for once I'm in time, and I'm very happy to reply any questions and to hear what all the speakers that we are very happy to have with us today would add as comments. Many thanks, and you can upload the publication in English and French on the Housing Solutions platform website and on FIANSA website. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Chloe. It's a great report and great job sticking to the time, so thanks for that. I don't see lots of questions in the chat now. And we have a Q&A planned for after our first panel. So I would just encourage you, if questions leapt to mind while you were listening to Chloe, pop them in the chat and we can bring them up in the discussion after our first panel. So the first panel is called Practitioner Perspectives, and we have 4 speakers who are going to provide some feedback on the report based on their own experiences. They're all involved either in providing services to homeless people or to providing affordable housing. And they are Mauro Striano from Brus Help, which is a centre in charge of solutions for homeless people in the Brussels region. Donald McManus, who's CEO of the Irish Council for Social Housing. Arnaud de Broca, who is the Director General at UNAFO, which is an umbrella organisation for the supported housing sector in France. And Michael Mont, I think, who is the CEO of the Champlain Housing Trust, which is a community land trust in the USA that has quite a lot of experience in converting motels into affordable housing through this type of program. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mauro, who is our first panelist.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. So in Brussels, we started using hotels to host homeless people, mainly people sleeping rough or people who were hosted in emergency accommodation. This was back in April 2020, so at the beginning, let's say, of the pandemic. The number of people accommodated varied over time, but at its peak, there were 11 hotels mobilized and around 900 people accommodated. At the end of June of this year, several hotels were closed down, and at the moment there are still around 200 people in the hotels. There will be maybe 2 additional hotels that will be open during the winter plan. So the objectives of these hotel projects changed over time. So in the beginning, it was really urgent to shelter a number of people sleeping rough or who were accommodated in big emergency shelters. So it was really a low threshold access with no need to have a residence permit nor an income. But after a few months, when it was clear that the use of hotels was about to become medium and even longer term, so the objectives evolved towards social inclusion, access to housing, and there were new criteria put in place. So basically now the people who are hosted in the hotels, most of them, they have even to pay to stay there. And they need to have, most of them, they need to have a residence permit. So we carried out an evaluation. There were several things that worked out, and these were underlined, highlighted in the report as well that Chloe produced. So of course, I mean, when we compare the hotels, the use of hotels to traditional emergency shelters, there are many things that are better quality solution that, well, in terms, for instance, of guaranteeing a certain level of privacy, feeling of security, stability, some kind of autonomy. And it was also better for professionals who accompany homeless people because it was easier to be in contact with the beneficiaries and to follow up their situations. And when we look, we in the evaluation, we also had a part of it which was quantitative. We compared 3 hotels, and in these 3 hotels, around 30% of people could move on to other solutions. 15%, more or less, 20 people out of 130, they even found housing. But of course, there were also things that didn't work out, and there were many things that didn't work out. I will just highlight 2 things here for this debate. First was the cost. So it was like the cost was between 60 and 80 euros per day per person. This, of course, includes the rent of the hotels, which sometimes was quite high, depending on the hotel, the staff, and all the management costs. And also it was ineffective to certain categories of homeless people. The first is irregular residing migrants. So basically it was almost impossible to move on for them because there was no way to regularize their situation while they were residing in the hotels. And the second category was people with very serious mental health and addiction problems. So my first concern in general, in relation to the conversion of hotels into housing for homeless people, is really who would benefit, at least as far as Brussels is concerned, who would benefit from this conversion? Because in the light of our experience, if we converted a hotel into housing units, this would be used to house people who have an administrative status and who have some kind of income. Basically, those who have access to the social assistance system, thus have a minimum income. So this would exclude once again irregular residing migrants, and irregular residing migrants are a huge proportion of the people who are sleeping rough, who are hosted in emergency accommodation in Brussels. And the second category that I mentioned is people, normally it's like the really what traditional housing first profiles, who at least in Brussels, I don't know, in the other cities, they don't really fit with a community, let's say, environment in which there are many people who have very serious problems who are gathered in the same place. And then the second concern is really related to the will of the public authorities to finance that. So we, the conversion of offices and industrial buildings was in place already before COVID. So it's been hundreds of thousands square meters already, hundreds of thousands of square meters were already converted over the last 20 years, but with a very different objective in Brussels, which is the real estate promotion, particularly in working class areas where public authorities have been trying to attract the middle class. It's really the typical gentrification process. So in a study of a bank, the ING, which was published in 2019, so before COVID, there were already two, there are several challenges that were highlighted, two of which I would retain for the debate today. The first is something that you already highlighted in your report. So it's the change in how to change a building's designated use from commercial to residential. And of course, public authorities can be willing to do that when there is some kind of return in terms of financial matters. And the second is really the need to buy the buildings at very low prices, since the refurbishment cost can be extremely high. When we look at the budget, in the Brussels regions, there are 926 million euros that are allocated to housing, which is almost 10% of the total budget. But roughly 50% of this budget, of the housing budget, is allocated to social housing, around 450 million euros. But the reality is that most of this is used to refurbish social housing already existing that was built in the 60s and the 70s. Only around a few hundred new social housing units are built every year, while the number of households in the social housing waiting list is now 44,000 households, meaning around 100,000 individuals. In reality, the priority of Brussels public authorities with regard to housing in the working class areas has been to make available housing units newly built via a partnership between a public agency, CityDev, and the real estate promoters, subsidized at around 30% of the market price from buyers who have income 3 times higher than the public who are entitled to social housing. So this, again, is really to attract the middle class in the working class areas. So to end my intervention, 2 concerns. The first is really the profile, and the second is, are public authorities willing to to spend a huge budget to convert a hotel in maybe 20, 30 housing units for people who, in terms of tax revenue, are not the best fit for them. And I'm sorry to be pessimistic, and I'm very happy during this debate to find arguments to use with public authorities. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Mauro. Lots of interesting points to come back to during the discussion, I think. And I expect that many of our speakers will also have questions in relation to the profile and the costs for this kind of conversion project. So our next speaker is Donald McManus, who is the CEO of the Irish Council for Social Housing. Donald, I'll hand over to you to respond from the perspective of the voluntary social housing sector in Ireland. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks to the authors for useful report. What I will probably cover is probably a bit broader than the hotel conversion. Just to say that in Ireland, we have had a tradition over the last 20 years of converting non-residential buildings into residential buildings, not necessarily just for the homeless, but for other groups as well. So I just want to put that in context for homeless households, families, older people, people with mental health problems. And so that has been a tradition before. I think that this report really, especially in relation to hotels and so forth, has put the spotlight into how to repurpose some of those buildings at greater scale. So from our point of view, our members have about 45,000 homes, long-term housing primarily, and the majority of that, well, half of that would be for single households and small households like homeless, elderly people, and people with disabilities. And about roughly, we estimate around 2,500 to 3,000 homes would we call repurposed buildings over the years. I'll give an example of that. Many older institutional buildings, things like convents, to commercial buildings like cinemas, bed and breakfasts, which are kind of mini hotels and small hotels, as well as Coast Guard stations, have been all repurposed into social housing. And in that context, homeless people would have benefited from that point of view. So there has been conversion of very public buildings. And I think one of the issues we have at the moment is in relation to like offices, whether it's private or public offices. We're already seeing some of our members with municipalities, one in Cork, for instance, where the municipality is going to transfer their underoccupied offices to housing association to provide housing for families and for single people. So this is kind of the modern version of what we did before. I would have to say in terms of repurposing older accommodation, certainly there's challenges and there's risks both for the promoter and also for the funder as well. And by and large, you can see and mention the report, longer lead-in times than you would have for a traditional greenfield site, for instance. And you know, there's obviously greater investigation and due diligence required, both from a technical side and from a legal side as well. And sometimes you're dealing with older documentation, which is a problem for modern day refurbishment. I think the recommendation by the CEB in the report of a contingency fund is very useful, because you tend to have more overruns with conversions than you will have greenfield sites. So that's a useful reflection of our, for instance, our members would see overruns from that point of view. You can do the best due diligence you can for older conversion, but something will crop up. For instance, we had a number of years ago, a building was being reconverted for homeless household, homeless foyer, and there were 500 bodies found under the site from Viking times. So there's an example where things crop up and you wouldn't have forecast that. I think in general terms, we've had a few current examples where during COVID, a few housing bodies, housing associations took over the management of hotels to allow homeless people to isolate for a period of time. A couple of those hotels are going to be acquired now on a long-term basis by the housing association to provide long-term tenancies. So that's where you have work that was done in COVID now has been transferred into long-term tenancies. I think obviously, it was mentioned before, when you look at any building, whether it's an hotel or any other public building, you're looking at the physical layout, the configuration, the quality of these buildings. For instance, we don't want another repeat of Grenfell in terms of commercial buildings. So, you know, is the building open plan? Has it got a hotel hallway? So all these things will impact on the feasibility of the project, whether it can be converted into long-term housing. I think to make these solutions more mainstream, as I say, a lot of our conversions over 20 years were ad hoc, primarily led by the housing organisation with support from the local municipality and from the government as well. And they kind of were hard to replicate. A lot of these projects are quite unique, although there is general learning, what you can learn on processes like technical, financial, and legal. They tend to be very, very special type projects. So maybe with hotels, there's more commonality with that. Certainly, I think on two levels, looking at the solutions on two levels, on a strategic policy level and the operational level, certainly policies at the national and municipality level, including things like taxes, planning consent, are key. And I know in Ireland, again, we'll talk after about the Housing for All policy document for 10 years, which tries to align both the policies at the national level, local level, and as well as funding as well. So at an operational level, legal and funding issues will be key, as well as in some cases upfront costs. You'll experience a lot of upfront costs with conversions that you don't necessarily experience with new build projects. That's an area maybe in the report as it evolves will be pointed to. In terms of buy-in, it was mentioned the NIMBY factor, and even if it's rebranded from a homeless project to a singles project, it doesn't really get around some of the difficulties that locals will raise about that. So I think in our experience, if you get good buy-in at local level from elected members and councillors, that's a major impact in reducing barriers, because you have to, in some cases, seek change of use, and that's where the elected members can play a key role. So I think they're important. That's an important factor in trying to, at the operational level, how you get buy-in for that. I think, as I said, aligning the national and local policy with the funding mechanism is fundamental, I think, to make these schemes work. And I think, as well as providing added value, to make sure funders clearly know, how this, even the EU funding can dovetail with national funding. I think in the past, in Ireland, we haven't used an awful lot of European funding, whether it's EU Next Generation or cohesion funding for these projects. I think that would help if there was better sort of clarity on that. At the moment, what our members are doing on conversions is on a very much practical level. We've quite high vacancy rates in certain towns and cities throughout the country. We've issues about a lot of banks being closed. We have one housing association that's just reconverted a bank into both offices, their own offices, and homeless accommodation as well. There's 80 banks closing in one situation. We have also pubs. We have 4 housing associations converting pubs into residential accommodation as well. So these things are continuing to emerge, especially as the economy changes. And I think one of the issues we don't know at the moment, and I think it's going to be a couple of months down the road, we see what is the impact on tourism and what is also the impacts on people transition back to work. And I think it's probably too early to say. I think probably in 6 or 9 months we'll know better. Is this a systemic change we can utilize as an opportunity, or is it just a more temporary medium-term phenomenon? So look, I think there is potential for conversions. Obviously from a development point of view, a lot of due diligence has to be undertaken before it translates into an idea, into delivery for people who are homeless. So maybe I'll just leave it at that, Ruth, for now. If there's any other questions, we'll take those after.
Okay, thanks very much, Donald. Brought up lots of interesting sort of big issues there, and also maybe some ideas about future niches for these kind of conversion housing solutions. So I'd like to hand over now to Arnaud, who is going to speak in French. So remember that you have the interpretation button. If you're not already using it, you just click on the globe and select the language that you want to listen to. So Arnaud is from the umbrella organization for supported housing organizations in France, and yeah, he'll reply to the report from that perspective. I think it would be really interesting to hear about, like, from the point of view of your members, what's the potential and maybe some of the dangers of this kind of intervention. Thanks very much.
Très bien, merci.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Sorry to speak French, says he, but it will be easy for me. I'll try to focus on what we call pension de famille, family houses, and what we are doing in France for the moment. I totally share what was said in the report, of course, on the fact that the crisis highlighted the possibility to convert hostels into social housing and into boarding houses or guest houses. So what do we mean by pension famille, which is not very well chosen as a term in French, pension famille, because it has nothing to do with hosting families, actually. It doesn't mean a house for families. It means some kind of housing for isolated people, mostly men from a statistical point of view, but also women, most of whom are former street homeless or in temporary housing. So these are houses that gather about 20 to 30 units of small scale, 20-25 square meters, which is quite big enough. Of course, it's all relative. So about 25 housing units for isolated people with a support. So support, these are supported housing. That's the specificity of pension famille, because we have a duo of guests, a duo of people, a couple of people whose main mission is to support the individuals in their administrative approach and in the design of possible collective initiatives. So that's the support part of the process. And there are also collective spaces where collective actions can be initiated. In our pension famille, in our boarding house, there are 20,000 of them, and we also have the Housing First plan in France, the objective of which would be to build 10,000 extra boarding houses in 2022, from 2022 on. So we intend to build 5,000 new units in 2022. And the political will is to further develop the system of pension famille, of boarding houses, following the crisis. And it was decided to speed up the transformation, the conversion of hostels into such boarding houses. So I think that it would be quite appropriate to do so as hostels can be turned into about 25 units. Most of the hostels of that size, and very often there are already collective spaces in hostels. Very often they are well located, situated in a district next to public transport. That's also what we'd want to do when we develop pension famille. We try to mainstream it. We want to integrate it at local level. So the conversion of hostels can be appropriate. That would be a good idea, but it's not that easy to do. As it was already said, it's not a piece of cake. Hostels of that type, very often we speak about hostels that went bankrupt because of the health crisis. So these are not automatically the best ones, and they are not always fit. The building itself is not always in the best possible shape. The rooms are relatively small in our pension famille. The objective is to guarantee sustainable housing, so they can stay there whenever they want, as long as they want. Of course, they have to pay some money. They have to pay some rent, and they can stay there as long as they want. So the size of the rooms is not always appropriate. Staying one night in a hostel, in a small room, it's something, and the needs of boarding houses may be quite different. The size is a matter here. And that's very often the feedback of our members. They keep telling us that we'll have to make a massive conversion, a massive renovation of the hotel. It's not easy as well, but this applies to any project aiming at developing boarding houses. It's not always easy to manage the neighbors. I had a discussion last week with a member on that. Very often neighbors don't really appreciate the conversion of hotels into boarding houses for ex-homeless people. And that's quite typical, let's say. It happens all the time. We'll have to convince the neighbors also, the inhabitants. So, meaning that there are quite a lot of hurdles on top of the costs, on top of administrative or legal hurdles concerning the building itself. It may be problematic. It also raises some concerns with the elected officials, but yet it remains a solution that our members are envisaging, are contemplating, because it makes it possible also to find real estate. Very often it's easier to tear down the hotel and build it back instead of renovating it. And I visited a series of houses last week in the framework of a project during which the city decided to bring down a hotel and just use the land, because it's quite difficult to find vacant land in the cities. So by tearing down a hotel, it's a way to empty some land. So that's what I'm being told about such ideas. And the government doesn't only want to turn the hotels into boarding houses, but also into social houses, meaning some kind of boarding houses with much more units, which we already did in the past. It was not easy, because in the past, these were hotels in the industrial parts of the city, which doesn't really answer the need to host people with specific needs. So, as what was said earlier, the question is, it should be done on a case-per-case basis. The relevance to turn a hotel into a boarding house, that's a case-per-case decision to be made. In France, at least. In many of the cities in France, there is this willingness to turn the hotels into pension famille, into boarding houses. It's not really difficult to convince the elected for the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Arno. I'll just hand straight over to Michael, and then we should have some time for discussion afterwards.
Thank you. I was not ready for that quick introduction.
It's more like breakfast time for Michael. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Michael Monti here. I'm the CEO of the Champlain Housing Trust. We're the largest community land trust in the United States, and we work principally in Northwest Vermont, a small state in the United States, serving about a couple 100,000 people. We have around 2,600 apartments. And we also do a shared equity program for home ownership and a range of other programs. About half of our folks who live in our housing are very low income. 20% or so of our housing is filled with folks who are formerly homeless. Since 2013, we purchased about 8 motels. And currently we are looking at 2 more, 5 in the past year or so through the pandemic. Of the 8, 2 are currently motels. 1 operates as a COVID isolation quarantine motel for folks who are homeless. And Vermont has not had a homeless person who has died as a result of sort of the work that the state has done to support homeless folks. One is a shelter, 2 are apartments, but specifically for folks who are chronically homeless, and 3 are apartments. My questions were very specific in terms of how we approach this. So the first thing we do when we see an opportunity to buy a motel, hotel, we have a staff architect. We have a person who has a history of doing lots of contract work, and also an energy specialist, and a range of folks who are developers with a lot of experience. And they look at 2 principal issues. Does a building meet local building codes? Does it have fire suppression systems? Does it have electrical for it's very specific to its rooms? And does it meet local land use regulations? And based upon the size and configuration of the motel, we determine the number of apartments that can be created. And so we'll look at 100 motel room hotel and say, based upon zoning and a review of the property itself, we could create 70, let's say, apartments out of that place, out of that hotel. For determining the apartments, we were either looking at a motel, which is a suite motel, which has kitchens already, or we're looking at combining 2 rooms. And so we immediately assess, can 2 rooms be converted, 1 room bathroom being converted to a kitchen and a living area, the second room being the bathroom and a bedroom. And so basically taking a 200 square foot or 250 square foot room, I know I should probably be using meters, but sorry. And converting those into basically a small apartment as a result of combining 2 rooms, closing 1 door and putting a door, creating a 2-room apartment. After we look at the building condition and the zoning, we assess the purchase value and estimate rehab costs. If it could be done relatively quickly at a lower cost, meaning if we could have this up and running in 6 months, and if the cost per unit for building it as much as half the price of new construction, we proceed. We also look at what we call curb appeal in order the property will be positive for residents. In other words, we have passed on properties which don't fit into what we would see as a decent living experience for the individuals because of its location or the sort of general condition of the surrounding area. And so once we sort of do that assessment, again, zoning and code pricing, then we get really serious and we get into the details and test our assumptions. We are in constant communication with our funders about opportunities. And during this pandemic, funds have flowed quickly and relatively efficiently to enable us to buy essentially 6 hotels and convert over the last year or so. Prior to that, we've used a variety of sources, patient capital from funders, different parties who are interested in placing them funds with us where we pay very little interest rate. And even a medical center has provided us with funding in order to buy properties, in order to serve folks who are chronically homeless. Before we buy the property, we look at, when we think about this overall idea, we think of the 3 S's. For us, it's supply. Is it a good source? Is it going to be a good project? Good capital investment? Subsidy.
What has been on, is it?
Subsidy, or is there another source? Is there another source of funding to support the tenants and creating their paying for their rent and services? What we often do is we make sure that there's enough money flowing from the property in order to pay for services. On occasion, we have had different funding sources come in to support those services, but the services part of what we do is really important. We have tried to, as much as possible, be in constant communication with local communities, local townspeople, chiefs of police, and we try to do the best we can to ensure that we are responsive as owners and provide the support that the tenants and our residents need. For us, in order to be able to do this, we needed to be very financially strong and disciplined. And we need to be very strong in our operations. We need to make sure that we are including all the people in the community, legislators, political leadership, and local leadership. So I think I'll end there, knowing that there's only a little time and questions and answers may be more appropriate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm very lucky as an undisciplined chair to have such disciplined speakers. It's really interesting and inspiring for such a short contribution. We so far don't have many questions in the chat, but I think that there were one or two questions that came to my mind from listening to each of you, and a few recurrent themes around technical issues, the speed and cost, both as a potential challenge, but also one of the major reasons why this is an interesting avenue to pursue. And I would like to ask a question to Arnaud, maybe that link back to the issues that Mauro raised at the beginning about the profile of the people housed in these projects, because he was saying in the Brussels context, it wouldn't make sense, or it's difficult to match the main part of the homeless problem with the potential target group for the housing that you could create through this kind of conversion. And I wondered for the pension de famille, if Arnaud could say a little bit more about the target group, and especially people with different administrative status. And then I also think, for all of the speakers listening to you, it would be really interesting to hear, perhaps briefly, we're having this discussion now in terms of the COVID pandemic. And Donald said, it's probably a bit early to see the long-term impact on the tourist industry and on offices and on city dynamics. And I'm sure that's true. But I wonder from each of you briefly, what do you see that's happened during this period that could potentially be important to build on going forward, or possible to build on going forward? So I don't know, perhaps Arnaud, if you could answer the question about the people who are housed in your projects in pension de famille.
Alors, sur les publics logés en pension de famille, alors c'est, comme je disais rapidement tout à l'heure.
Pension de famille, as I said very briefly before, it's mainly people who are rough sleepers or who were accommodated in emergency housing. Most of them are single people, and their income are very precarious. Most of the time it's male residents. It's not a solution aimed at men specifically, but in the statistics we see that male people are overrepresented. And in your question, you also hinted at the aging of the population. So how can we accommodate people who are aging in the pension de famille? But anyway, most of the time, the people we accommodate are people who deal with social services. And that's it. That's my answer. So there's no specific profile. It can be quite broad, but most of the time it's people who are over 50. They've experienced a lot of difficult circumstances. They are rough sleepers. They are in a very vulnerable situation, and they get a housing unit there, a sustainable unit, after years and years of a very difficult life. Yes, but I think that they have a minimum income. Yes, because they have to pay a rent, a housing contribution, if I may say so. So they have a minimum income indeed. But we also have a facility. It's a housing support facility. We can criticize it quite a lot, but anyway, this mechanism allows people housed in pension famille get these subsidies, and thanks to that, they can pay for their rent. But they have minimum income, yes, quite obviously.
Thank you very much. Maybe have a think if any of the panelists would like to respond on the question about COVID. And in the meantime, we have had a question from Wayne Stanley in Ireland asking, we had the impression from the discussion, is it true that maybe hotels are particularly better suited to this kind of conversion than offices or other sort of industrial settings? Is there something particularly about hotels that makes them good candidates for this kind of conversion?
Certainly, they are doors. For a US, they are simply doors. They are very much set often enough as simply apartments. And so it's very easy to sort of see, again, not all, but it's easy to see that many can be simply turned into a good and decent apartments. And you have to take into consideration the size. You have to make sure that they're big enough and sort of location. But once you do those two things, then the cost is really what you have to determine whether it makes some sense. So yes.
I think indicatively, like in Brussels, when we look at the number of empty housing units, I think that the solution in terms of cost effectiveness and quality of the housing that we already have at disposal, maybe we don't need to convert hotels to find that. I mean, if we had a budget to use, it would probably be for housing that was empty for several years and that needs to be refurbished and to be occupied. I mean, there are many buildings. When we last year we wanted to find as many solutions as possible for people who were in the hotels, and we found places that were like adequate for that. That needed some work, of course, but so that's why I think in terms of at the moment the public authorities in Brussels have never taken into consideration to buy a hotel. This is not a solution that was put on the table, because there's also that's there, like the empty buildings, but also there is also social housing that is not used as well. I mean, because it needs a certain level of refurbishment, and there is no budget to do that. So if there was money, probably it would be put on those kind of housing solutions.
Okay, thank you. I think Arnaud wants to come in, and then afterwards, I think we won't take any more questions in this Q&A because we'll need to move on to the next panel. But Arnaud?
Non, rapidement pour répondre à la question, effectivement là j'ai beaucoup parlé des hôtels, mais il y a aussi d'autres. Alors il y a la question des logements vacants qui vient d'être évoquée, mais on a aussi d'autres exemples, par exemple dans des casernes militaires qui peuvent se prêter aussi à une réhabilitation sous forme de résidence sociale ou de pension de famille. D'hôpitaux aussi. Donc, il y a effectivement d'autres lieux qui peuvent être tout aussi bien placés dans les villes et qui peuvent aussi se prêter à cette transformation, même si ça n'empêche que ce n'est jamais si facile que ça et que ça nécessite quand même de le préparer, de le travailler et avec des coûts importants. Mais il y a évidemment d'autres lieux et ça se pratique en France, d'autres lieux que les hôtels.
Okay. Thanks very much. Maybe just to link into the next panel, I think lots came up about financing in what all the panelists had to say, and is probably part of the response or answer to some of the things that we've just heard. Mauro saying about the scope for public authorities to invest in this kind of acquisition and conversion, but there are lots of different financing models from the other promoters that we've heard about in the panel. So I think that kind of helps leading us on to the next panel, which is about financing perspectives. And we have 3 speakers here. The first one is Michelle Norris, who's the chair of the Irish Housing Finance Agency, which provides financing to local authorities and housing associations. Jarmo Linden, who's the director of ARA, which is the Housing Finance and Development Centre of Finland, and Samir Kilonovic, sorry, Samir, I'm struggling today. Samir Kulinovic, who is an advisor on housing and urban development at the Council of Europe Development Bank. So I'll hand over to Michelle to respond to the report from her perspective.
Ruth, and thanks for inviting me along today. I just want to welcome the report, first of all. I mean, I don't wish to understate the undoubted challenges of converting non-residential buildings for use for social housing and housing for homeless people, but I think it's worth restating the benefits. So it fulfills a key social need. It also is a measure that will help us densify our cities and improve land use. And also in many countries, including in Ireland, there's quite a significant shortage of labour in terms of construction, in the construction industry. So the reuse of existing buildings helps that. And also it's an environmentally friendly solution. The lowest carbon housing solution is existing housing. So there's many benefits. In terms of the challenges and the focus, I thought the debate about the use of hotels was quite an interesting point, because obviously there are key practical advantages in terms of reconverting hotels for housing purposes, in the sense that they have sufficient plumbing, bathrooms, kitchens, etc. They're often newer buildings, and so they're easier to convert into apartments. But there are also significant disadvantages in terms of, in lots of cities, the future predicted use of hotels, etc. And a tourist market is kind of unpredictable at the moment. But also there is also an issue around the socio-spatial segregation of existing homeless services within many cities. So including Dublin, where I'm based, many homeless services are in the inner city. And many hotels are in the inner city. And one potential benefit, I think, of reconverting non-residential facilities for use for housing for homeless people and social housing is the potential to try combat that socio-spatial segregation of homeless people and help people move to other areas apart from inner cities. So certainly in the Irish context, I think there is a lot of vacant space above shops and in shops. And we do know now that there is a long-term pattern of use of move away from usage of shops and Main Street, long-term decline of high streets. So I personally think reconversion of shop units and reconversion of space over shops would help. That would also help, that approach to reusing existing dwellings would also help address a very significant need in relation to homeless accommodation in this country, because about 60% of our existing social housing stock is 3 or 4 bedroom dwellings. So it's family type housing, and almost all the rest is reserved for older people. It's for pensioners. So for the majority of the homeless population are single people or 2-person households. And for them, it's almost impossible to move from homelessness into social housing. So the conversion of shops, etc., would give us an opportunity to add smaller units to the social housing stock. That would be very, very beneficial. In relation to financing, I noticed in the report the emphasis of the need to have distinct funding for capital, the conversion costs, and also separate funding for support. And that's something that's certainly necessary. In the Irish context, that's something we've been quite weak on. We've had relatively generous capital funding for social housing and very traditionally not so generous revenue funding to the extent that maintenance has often been a problem, but particularly if we're looking to house people who were formerly homeless, there is a need not only to fund maintenance, obviously, but to fund support service. I forgot to mention that, you know, existing buildings that could also be repurposed for long-term social housing include congregated homeless accommodation, which we currently have somewhat of an oversupply in Dublin. So there is the potential to try reconvert those dwellings back. And for the providers, the NGOs that provide those that accommodation, it would create challenges if they moved into mainstream social housing, because under the current funding model, the revenue funding and the support funding isn't there. So that would certainly have to be addressed. And then finally, the report raises some very interesting and really important points about overcoming barriers to development. Obviously, buildings vary, you know, non-residential buildings you might want to convert vary a lot, but I think there still is the potential for exemplar projects, particularly for converting space over shops, for instance. Many, you know, towns and smaller urban settlements have rows of shops that are very similar in construction. So there could be exemplar developments there in terms of fire safety approaches, materials, approaches to design, etc., that would help the process of converting. I share some of the concerns around, you know, not using, not having just a deregulatory approach to promoting the conversion of non-residential dwellings for residential use that was mentioned in the report and also mentioned in Chloe's excellent presentation. And I wonder whether deregulation is really necessary. In my view, a lot of the challenges around the reconversion of dwellings are not necessarily due to the number of regulations. It's due to the administrative burden of trying to manage all the different regulations simultaneously. So if there was a kind of a one-stop shop service where municipalities could provide support to social housing providers and enable them to do a single application for change of use, fire safety certificates, etc., I think that would certainly help some of this activity. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle. I think you highlighted a few things that lead on very well to hearing from Jarmo about things that have happened in Finland and maybe how they have been financed. So Jarmo.
Yeah, hello. Yes, I'm about to tell how we conversed those former shelters and hostels used by homeless persons to supported housing. That happened when we changed the ideology of homelessness policies in Finland in 2008, and we adopted this housing first policies instead of the staircase models when there was the services of different types of social and health services were in the first hand and not housing. At that time, in Helsinki, there was about 600 beds for homeless population, and nowadays there is only one emergency unit with 50 beds for people coming right from the street. And this conversion was done rapidly in years 2009 to 2011 as part of the Housing First national policies. So the idea was to get rid of the culture of homelessness, helping homeless in a way that doesn't reproduce the situation as a homeless night after night. And that's why we put money on the renovation of these shelters away. The biggest one was administered by the Salvation Army in Helsinki, very city center downtown. There was beds for 250 persons. and it was renovated so that now it is a housing unit with proper rental apartments, 81 apartments. And the cost of the project was about 8.5 million euros at the time. Now it would be maybe the double. But it was covered the expenses of the renovation. So at 45% of the expenses for government subsidy grant, investment grant, and the rest, 55%, was interest subsidy loan with government guarantee. So the agency I'm working in, Housing Finance and Development Center, is operating with these tools. So that was part of the mechanism we have, investment grants for special groups. So it was calculated that people after the renovation who are living there with their own personal rental contract can pay the rent. So the grant was justified to the situation. Okay, then the rent will be maybe 350 euros at the time. And those people having these contracts, they can apply for social benefit, and they get that support from the other agency like all other people. And if that's not enough, then they can apply for social assistance from the same institution. So the idea that you have your own contract and you pay your rent. If you can't do that, you can ask that the institution will direct that money directly to the landlord. In Finland, we use about 2.5 billion euros for subsidizing rental housing rents directly to the tenants, and that's over 4% of the total government expenses, and 15% of population is getting housing benefits in Finland. So, but the basis is the mixed support system. There has to be both supply side subsidies and demand linked subsidies. If you have only one, I think it won't work. And of course, if you have a housing unit for people who have special needs, then there has to be close cooperation between housing and social authorities, that there is enough those services, social and health services available, hopefully tailor-made in that unit. For instance, in that Salvation Army former shelter, when it was shelter with 250 men sleeping there overnight, there was 7 doormen. Now there is 81 apartments, and there are at least 22 employers, trained professionals in social work and health, and that part is paid by the municipality. So it's a cooperation between the different government agencies and the municipality agencies. That
Thanks, Jarmo.
the municipality is financing these care services. Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that echoes some of what Donald was saying at the beginning about the need for coherence between the national and local policy frameworks, and also lots of what we've heard about the need to combine financing for the buildings as such with maybe more subsidies and grants for services. Samir, hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth. And this has been very good event. It's difficult to find a corner which has not been addressed already, and I can just echo what colleagues said earlier. I just want to reflect on the very good work that you've done, and I really like the layout of the report, and it flows very nicely, and it provides the roadmap how to look into the projects involving the reconstruction or reuse rehabilitation of the existing buildings. You know, starting with the housing policy, which is very important, then feasibility study, but also not forgetting the views of the end users and their needs. So that's extremely, extremely important. Gives great examples, you know, overcoming legal and technical barriers and social obstacles in particular. So absolutely well done. It is also talks about the a long-term investment horizon and social benefits. So I work for Council of Europe's Development Bank, which is Social Bank of Europe, and our governance and mission is such that in order to finance a project, there has to be a good social impact of such a project. And then when it comes to the rehabilitation of the existing buildings, project examples that we had, but also other project examples like and program examples like Home Key in LA and so on. In France, we had the Hemisphere, etc. I think there is always state behind. And in particular, when it comes to the emergency, the state usually provides grants. So when it comes to financing of such a project in emergency situation on a grant scale, the state is the investor, basically the main player. So I think one thing is to be aware of is that the state as investor is like any other investor. So it is very important to be aware that in some situations, state may try because of the urgency so to cut the corners. So there are examples in the United States where some cities were sued because they did not provide the ramp for people with impaired mobility, for example. So I think in such financing, it's important to have a safeguards. That state imposes safeguards itself. So, for example, engagement of NGOs is very important because what we don't want to happen is that the state intervention can result in trade-off of social outcome. That's very important. That's very important to address. The other thing is because we have Michelle here, and she wrote a very good paper on comparative analysis of financing housing in Ireland versus Denmark. And I remember from that paper, like that a multiple layer of financing is a good thing to do. And I think it is. So, and it is really the matter how we put those financing on top of each other and how they interact. So I think in this context, it is important to remember that there are different initiatives in EU with the Commission, like Invest EU, for example, the different funds, social funds, etc. So I think combination of these is very important. And I'm glad to know and understand that there is this platform making how to end up homelessness. So it is very important that the potential users of this funding understand how to use it, but also from the perspective of a single place. Like Michelle said, administratively, it's very difficult to get the building permits and so on. So one point of the financing would be very important and would make financing attractive and also more accessible and understandable for the potential borrowers, let's say. So I can give an example of regional housing program, which is program for refugees and internally displaced persons. So that was financed through through the Regional Housing Program Fund, managed by the bank, but financed by the Commission and other donors. So, that was 80% grant, 20% was national contribution. Of course, a grant and national contribution and plus loan could be set up in such a way that incentive grant is given to the local communities, cities, regions, and so on, who want and wish to resolve the housing problem for the homeless people. So I think that's also important to reflect. The participation of the local communities, we cannot overestimate it. It is extremely important. Yes, it's very interesting to hear that there are different type of real estate that could be converted into housing. In Ireland, pubs, I love this, or hospital, or putting the houses on top of the shops and so on. It really shows that the housing is very specific, very dynamic, very local issue in a way, and changes quite rapidly. Attractive areas become non-attractive. We've seen, like in last 2 years, that the housing prices are rising up, less in the center of the cities, more on the outskirts of the cities, because there is perception that people would be teleworking more and more. So it is really important to follow it. And if you remember, Ruth, actually with the offices, it was actually the study that was done for Prague project, where we looked to what are available real estate in Prague, and turned out that there are access of offices who could be potentially converted into the housing for homeless people. So it is very, very important. I think gender issue is, it was mentioned also. I think that's important to address as well in such a project. And I cannot overemphasize more about housing first model. We were just recently in Finland and met with the Y Foundation, and had a great, we really had a great exchange, and that model really makes sense. And from the financing perspective, I think it's important to replicate that model, adapt it to other countries, and try to do it as much as possible. It makes sense from socioeconomic perspective, psychological, and so on. So I think, thank you very much again, for invitation, and let's work on some of the projects. I think now the next step is to move into the project world and really try to solve the housing for the homeless people. Thanks a lot.
Maybe we need a regional homelessness fund for these kind of innovative housing solutions projects. So I'm just really aware of the time. There's one question in the chat to Jarmo, but the chat's open. You can continue to submit questions, and we can come back to them. But I'd like to hand over now for our third panel, which is about future perspectives, which I guess is looking further forward. What are the perspectives for these kind of conversion interventions? And I'd like to give the floor to Deborah Padgett, who's a professor at NYU Silver in the States, and who has written a paper about the role that these kind of conversions can play, particularly when it comes to hotels going forward and in the recovery from COVID-19.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes, okay. So thank you for this opportunity to speak on our National Indigenous Day holiday here in the US, formerly known as Columbus Day. I'm going to give a sort of a US perspective, which is kind of probably unnecessarily broad, but I have some opinions and I want to put them forward here. First of all, based upon the paper that we did write in the journal Psychiatric Services, but going beyond, those of us in the homeless advocacy and research circles here in the US are virtually one voice in arguing that an unintended but hopeful consequence of COVID is the availability of hotels for conversion, as has been discussed this morning. Here, it's a very time-sensitive change. It urgently needs action. I'm all in favor, but I'm also a strong proponent of housing first. I've written a book about the topic, and I worry about not just if and when these conversions can happen, but how they will follow through and what will happen. The problems we face in making these conversions happen are more than just funding, because, you know, the Biden administration, unprecedented amounts, $50 billion from the US Rescue Plan Act, and California alone has committed over $20+ billion to conversions to permanent housing. And I want to just juxtapose this to the unprecedented influx of funds to the fact that we in New York City here spend over $4 billion each year on homelessness. And almost all of that goes to shelters. But I digress. So I want to just briefly talk about some obstacles to hotel conversions that go beyond the NIMBY resistance and some, but that are fairly US specific. And I'm talking about the peculiar and what I would think is repugnant history of housing policies in the US. These policies favor white landowners and private real estate developers over virtually everyone else. So it's a strong difference from the tradition of social housing in Europe. It's different from our friends in the state of Vermont, which stands as a small and mighty model of what the rest of the US should follow. I think it's no accident that Bernie Sanders is their senator. But I want to get just quickly some historical precedents. Our history since World War II is using zoning restrictions, real estate and banking interests to conspire against multifamily dwellings outside of urban areas and to literally exclude African Americans from home ownership in vast swaths of this country. This system of racial exclusion and overall restrictions constitutes a set of legal and institutional shackles that must be shattered to make real progress. And as I alluded to just a minute ago, we have a shelter industry in New York City and some other cities where most public funding goes to shelters. And so there's very little incentive to take all those thousands of jobs away from the shelter industry and divert and invest that money into building housing. California is trying to skip the shelter industry phase and go directly into housing under the banner of Housing First. And that is very hopeful. I just want to recap that some of the issues here, which I'm not conversant enough in all of the details of the various European countries, knowing that Finland has overcome virtually all of the obstacles. But here we have zoning ordinances that forbid multifamily dwellings in suburbs and small towns. We have lengthy and very expensive building permit allocations. They're often corruptly awarded. So this makes hotel and other building conversions difficult, except for wealthy private developers. And I feel like in this country, that group has become the de facto overlords of our housing market. But we're still hopeful that we can cut through the red tape. There are some cities and localities in this country that have really done amazing work in already starting this process. Here in New York, we are nowhere near. We are running behind the rest of the country. But we have hundreds of hotels in New York that are going bankrupt and face possible demolition. That's why I'm saying time is of the essence. And, you know, land is so valuable here that the actual hotels themselves have less value, and we need to make sure that that's not ignored. But we do need, when these conversions, this is my Housing First hat, we need livable units with kitchens and bathrooms and bedrooms where rent is affordable. Residents need to have freedom and autonomy to live like other citizens. I suspect this happens in Europe, but in the US, we often do this kind of half measure, and it turns into institutional living, which is actually, as mentioned earlier, is not allowed under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But if we have institutional living in these hotels where there's security guards and curfews and rules, I fear they will become more inmates than community members. And this is where Housing First principles have to be held fast. And then my final word is, this is an emergency time. I hope we can take maximum advantage, but in this country, we need to commit government funding to invest in housing. and not just try to incentivize the private sector as if they will do the job that needs doing. This would reverse a long history of privatization and refutation of housing as a right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hand over now to Eamon, who is from the Department of Housing at the Ministry of Local Government and Heritage in Ireland. And hopefully we can hear a little bit about how this type of conversion initiative might fit into the very ambitious Housing for All plan that has just been launched in Ireland. So, thanks, over to you.
Thanks, Ruth, and to the other speakers as well. And thanks also for the report. It makes for very interesting reading. And as you said, I'm coming at it, I suppose, from the perspective of somebody involved in a government department with policy responsibility and responsibility for funding a lot of this work. And we've been recently involved in the development of policy in this area. So I suppose it's appropriate that I'd be looking to the future to say, well, this is how we see the future. And the future, as we see it in many ways, is built on the experience that we've had. And there's been quite an Irish flavour, I think, today. Donald, who might be familiar with, and also Michelle speaking about some of the practical issues that arise in this work on the ground. And then in terms of funding initiatives like this, from my perspective, I've been involved in reviewing some of these projects and proposals, particularly over the last year, and we would have seen some opportunities becoming available around COVID, particularly for hotels and guest houses, and looking at what do we want to get out of these types of buildings. How can we kind of maximize their use? How can we ensure that people who will ultimately live in these converted buildings can live in a degree of comfort? And also, how can we assure that it's good value? And that can be complex at times because you're dealing with existing structures. It's a bit more straightforward from a technical point of view. When you're building something new, you can evaluate the cost and look at what you want to build and develop, and maybe a bit more complex when you're looking at conversions. So I think the list of those three criteria for successful conversion, I think, are very interesting and very, very good. I think they capture, I think, at a very high level, what you need to see, I suppose, when embarking on an examination of maybe a particular project, and then looking beyond that on maybe a program of these types of projects. So I'm basing, I suppose, my views at the moment around experience in developing policy in this area. And I think the comment in the recommendations around ensuring that work is part of a proper and visible policy framework, I think, is very important. That it's underpinned, whether it's at a national level, national government level, by policy, and also underpinned, I think, at a municipal level, where delivery of units and delivery of buildings quite often resides. But policy is critical. So, for example, in our Housing for All document that was approved by government, we're very clear that the policy in addressing homelessness is housing-led. We want to provide housing rather than, say, emergency accommodation on a permanent basis. We have a policy objective to eliminate homelessness, and that's called out, and we put a timeline on that that's consistent with the recent European declaration on combating homelessness. So we want to eradicate homelessness by 2030. So to have an overarching high-level objective, and then built into that, there are specific actions, funding being mentioned, that we will provide capital funding for these projects. So that has to be said, that if you want to do something, you have to fund it. An issue as well, and I see it was called out in the successful criteria, and it's also reflected in the recommendations, is around ensuring good quality design, ensuring good quality standards. And one of the actions, and this will be partly informed by experience, that if a building is being converted, you have to know what you actually want to get out of it in terms of what it, you know, what size rooms do you want, what do you consider to be of a decent standard of accommodation for somebody to live in. Also, you know, acceptance that there may be a need for additional facilities, whether that's supporting health facilities on site, so that's factored in when the building is being designed for conversion. So one of the commitments, and we've started working on it, one of the commitments in our Housing for All policy is that we would develop standards for the conversion of existing buildings for use as housing, so that we're clear on what we want. There's also the question around future proofing as well, that when accommodation is being developed, that it's capable of being altered into the future. So what I'm talking about here is, say, you know, if you have a hotel that's being acquired, and that hotel is being converted, that at some point in the future it has to be capable of being, you know, adapted further to meet, you know, future needs, whether that's individuals around housing first, whether it's around larger scale units with multiple rooms. So so you're not just developing something for the here and now for next year, that it's part of a kind of a plan, and is capable of adapting as time goes on, adapting to environmental standards. So I suppose that those would be perspectives around what policy development looks like in a future policy development looks like in a particular country, it being Ireland. Of course, key challenge now will be implementing this. I think we have had good experience in these areas already, and some good examples, you know, from conversions. And I would have seen really innovative examples. I mean, one in particular that jumps out was in a provincial town in Ireland, a small town, where there wouldn't have been available one-bed units for housing first. And one of the approved housing bodies, a housing association, acquired a disused building, former commercial building, and converted it into one-bed apartments for use in housing first. And we're able to do that through a combination of working with the municipal authority, funding from national government level, and also a wider degree of support within the community as well. So I think it highlights, I think, at a practical level, the importance of working together with various stakeholders, and then at a national policy level, it being underpinned with quite strong and quite clear national policy. So that's a perspective. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and hopefully our plans and aspirations into the future come to fruition, and I might have a chance to come back and talk about them again, maybe in a couple of years' time, and we can see hopefully important progress being made.
Okay, thank you very much, Eamon. Hopefully we won't have to wait necessarily a couple of years to hear more about how it's going, because I think it's very exciting, and especially the commitment to ending homelessness, and the link to both Europe as a policy lever, but also very much as a funding and financing tool or added value as well. So we are running a bit behind time. There aren't any questions currently in the Q&A, but if there is anything burning, I suggest you raise it quickly now. Okay. But thanks very much to both of you, because I think it was really part of our objective with the report, was to stimulate the discussion about how these kind of interventions move forward and how they fit into wider policy goals and the objective of ensuring adequate and affordable housing for people who need it. So thanks a lot. we're moving now into our concluding remarks, but also feel like if you have questions that you just want to direct to one speaker, you can put them in the chat, and we can also reply directly to those questions. I'm going to give the floor to two extra speakers for the conclusions. The first one is Karel van der Poorten, who is from the European Commission, from DG GROW, and is working on the Affordable Housing Initiative at DG GROW. And the second is Sorka Edwards, who's the Secretary General of Housing Europe, which is the European Federation of Social Housing Providers in the EU. So, Karel, over to you first.
Thank you, Ruth. Also, thank you, all the participants. It was incredibly interesting to follow all these very different angles for a very specific topic. I must be honest with you. This is something that is very much in line and in scope with the ideas that were at the origin or the roots of the Affordable Housing Initiative since 1 year ago. The entire change in working habits that leads towards office buildings, but also other types of buildings that will not be used. By the way, today I'm physically present in a building that will probably not be there anymore in I think 5 years from now on. So I think it's already 40 years old. And it's supposed to be converted into a housing facility. So I'm literally in such a situation still today. And that makes me reflect a bit on the opportunities, but actually I'm not the expert here. I just want to capture the experience that was said today and also the experience I heard elsewhere. So sometimes I will repeat what others have been said, but also maybe some other reflections. And one very specific I would like to raise is the issue of position in the city of office buildings. And that is something that maybe was not very much touched upon today. I missed 15 minutes, or maybe it was, but that is something that is quite a challenge, because in many cities there are really like office quarters that have not the facilities as regular housing districts or housing quarters. So definitely when a part of these areas stays office and another part is converted into housing spaces, that might have some missing links. So therefore in the renovation, it's really crucial to pinpoint at those specific services, but also access to, for example, economic activities and facilities such as shops, but also other types of services such as creches, but just also open spaces for playgrounds, etc., green spaces, which are not usually very present in office neighborhoods. Not to mention the state of the building itself. Sometimes it might be that old or that let's say, in such a bad shape in terms of energy efficiency that reshaping the building or refurbishing the building into housing is not even the best appropriate solution. So demolition might be sometimes even better, as already was highlighted. So that is one very specific aspect that sometimes is overlooked. This is of course very specific to office buildings. For hotels, that is usually less a big issue. Another thing, and that was highlighted several times, which is also related to this type of aspects, is the engagement of the let's say the residents. Usually when you refurbish existing housing, the engagement of residents is pretty straightforward because they are living already there. But when you have completely new areas and new neighborhoods, that is less obvious, because you probably don't even know who will live there in the end, and when the facilities will be available. Definitely in the area of social services and the housing as a service, social housing, even sheltered housing solutions, that might be quite a tricky point and a very important point for attention. So there, the role of these NGOs, as also highlighted in the report, civil society organizations that have really this experience and knowledge is pretty crucial. When I take this back to the activities of my colleagues who are working on innovation in the construction sector, we have seen already very straightforward and quite innovative practices, for example, with modular housing. The only issue is that modular housing in offices, for example, is only a temporary solution. And that is a bit the Achilles heel, let's say, for those type of projects. It gives you only, let's say, some breadth margin for 5, maximum 10 years, but it is not a sustainable conversion of an office building into, let's say, long-term housing solution. So therefore, the policy is not always, the support in terms of policy is not always easy to develop, because this missing link of sustainable housing. On the contrary, when there is such an urgent need for crisis housing, sheltered housing, etc., that might be, of course, a very interesting solution. And I think that for example, in Brussels, there are some pretty straightforward experiences in that sense. But modular housing anyway can be a very interesting solution for the use of those type of buildings in different stages along the trip. So these are some observations, but of course, this engagement from the wider civil society, from the residents, these are things that are very close to the heart of the Affordable Housing Initiative, taking the aspect of livability next to energy efficiency upgrades and aesthetics. And this engagement with the residents is really a key point there. When I come to the innovation aspect, this conversion of those type of housing is definitely something that we, as I said from the beginning, had in our minds, and is definitely a very potential topic to include in the districts, and also with the calls that are launched currently. I think I will stop there, because Ruth, I think I put in your time schedule even more under pressure. Some small observations from my side, but thank you very much, because actually you gave again so much input for the Commission and for my colleagues to take with us, and to also engage further when the Affordable Housing Initiative will finally get on track early next year, when the partnerships are selected. Thank you very much, and have a very good continuation.
Thanks very much, Carol. Soka?
Yeah, thanks to all the speakers today. Thanks, Ruth. Great to see you all. Indeed, Carol, you give an indication of how many questions this topic will still raise, obviously. But when we decided to cover this topic, originally discussing with Clotilde, we realized it's really crucial timing. I mean, we've heard today about Ireland, for instance, rolling out the new housing plan, but also, of course, from EU level, there's a lot of funding that will now be going into renovation and new social and affordable housing construction. I mean, we estimate just in the recovery plan, 47 billion will be going into renovation, 5 billion into new affordable construction. And then, of course, you've got the next round of the structural funds. So, of course, many authorities looking for ideas and ways to use those funds. And then coupled with that, of course, and that's what we've been addressing today, the reason this session has been so useful is we've already identified a couple of ideas of what's needed. I think it was raised by Donald, so the need for more clarity on what funding can be used, how it can be blended, how we can blend between different types of loans like the CEB, EIB, but also from EU level, there's guarantees. So there's a need for more clarity around that. Donald mentioned that. And then in addressing this specific issue, the point was raised that it's really case by case. Samir mentioned it's a case by case. It's depending on the typology of the buildings, the local environment. And Michelle spoke about also a one-stop shop, or a place where we can speed up the whole process, looking for the advice around insurance, because obviously we're using buildings for something maybe they weren't intended for, insurance questions and practical questions. So it's already been really useful, and I think just an indication of the interest out there. And of course, if we put it in the bigger context, I think we know that there's really a call now for a new social contract in many spheres when it comes to both the housing crisis and the climate crisis. And therefore, this even is more arguments to use those vacant buildings, increase the density of areas to decrease to improve mobility and go towards this 15-minute city that we aspire to use existing materials and buildings also from the circular economy perspective. So there's this huge push now, and policymakers will be asked why they're not doing that as opposed to why do it. And then of course, and this is why we are here today, from the homelessness perspective, people have seen this is now in the social consciousness. We can solve this. We can address homelessness in a very short space of time if the political will is there. So people will also be asking, why isn't this being done more speedily when we have vacant buildings? So I think it's part of strongly in the societal awareness now that it's a choice not to address the housing crisis. It's a choice also not to address the climate crisis. And we have to find ways. But then, of course, as with many issues, it becomes too simplified. And what we can't, I think this is why it's been very useful, and Chloe's report as a background. There's no simple quick fix to this. And also the use of vacant buildings will just be a tiny part of the bigger solution. So that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to remind ourselves that yes, it's part of the solution, but there are a lot of buts. So we talked about, the complexities of dealing with different types of buildings, longer lead-in times, higher prices potentially than new build, and difficulty about regulations, about quality, about using buildings that weren't intended to be used as housing. So there's all those issues that is a reality check that we need to face. Also, we need to address the fact that this cannot be the only solution. So we have, something zero new construction. There's also parts of the environmental movement that are saying zero new construction, zero new use of land. But that cannot be the way either. We have to combine the new build with these types of more resourceful and creative approaches. So as Mauro pointed out, there's not enough housing being built for low-income groups. So this cannot be one choice ahead of another. And then finishing up, I think this point came through very strongly from really all of the speakers today, and particularly from Eamon at the ministry. I mean, this has to be part of a coherent housing policy. So that means looking at the governance question, the finance question, the land question. It cannot be isolated, separate. So it needs that overall umbrella of a coherent financing and a governance policy. And the last point, I think it also came very clearly through from all speakers, particularly from Jarmo. And I think this initiative today shows also the need for that collaboration. So collaboration between, particularly when we're addressing homelessness, the need for collaboration between local authorities, social services, municipality, people using those services themselves. And yes, that has to be a key part of the way forward. So no simple solution, but has been really, really useful discussion. So thank you all on behalf also of the HSP. I leave you Ruth to wrap up.
Thanks ever so much, Soka. I won't add much. I mean, I think the sentiment that I have at the end of the debate, and I wish we had more time, is these kind of solutions are useful. They're not a golden bullet, but as Michelle said, they're worth doing because we really need to bring more affordable and very affordable and supported housing online at scale and quickly in many places, especially urban, like city centres. So we're really grateful for all the inspiration that came from the speakers today. And I'll close there, but thanks again. And yeah, I think it's not the solution, but it's an example of how we can be a bit more courageous and creative about solving the housing crisis and addressing homelessness and housing exclusion.
Thank you.
In Europe and elsewhere. Okay, thanks ever so much.
Thanks a lot.